Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a discussion of one of the most vital challenges to American democracy right now, how we as a nation choose to fund our political campaigns. I'm Margie Hershey. I'm a professor of political science at Indiana University, and it's my privilege to serve as moderator. Our current system of campaign finance is not inevitable. In fact, it's not even typical of Western industrial democracies. There is a campaign taking place today, right now in Britain, to elect all members of Parliament and as a result the chief executive, and it does not involve billions of dollars being spent by self-interested donors. Each British major party is permitted to spend only about $30 to $35 million for all its candidates combined across the country, and the candidates themselves can't spend more than about $12,000 each. Most of them spend a great deal less. In pretty stark contrast, a press release from Freedom Partners, the business lobby, which is tax exempt, by the way, that's the central nervous system of groups backed by the Koch brothers, said it plans to spend $889 million on educational activities during the 2016 American elections. That's more than double the amount that the 17 groups in the Koch brothers network raised during the 2012 campaign. When we look at this contrast between Britain and the United States, a lot of questions arise. How did we get to the point where American political campaigns altogether spent $7 billion in 2012, and we can assume a lot more in 2016? Where's the money coming from? Does relying on campaign money from private sources rather than public money distort the principle that all Americans should have equal opportunity to affect public policy? Congress passed campaign finance reforms in the 1970s and again in 2002 with McCain-Feingold. The intent of those reforms was to stop big givers from having an unfair say in public policy because of their contributions. What happened to those reforms? We are very fortunate to have a brilliant panel of speakers tonight to talk about these issues. Let me introduce them to you and take just a moment to set the stage as to how we've gotten to this point. It's a great honor to introduce Representative Lee Hamilton. He has represented this area for 34 years in the United States House of Representatives. That means he was elected and re-elected 17 times to the United States House. Representative Hamilton chaired several House committees, including Foreign Affairs and the Joint Committee on the Operation of Congress, and since, quote, retiring, unquote, from the House, he has served as vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, co-chair of the Iraq Study Group, and on President Obama's Homeland Security Advisory Council, among others. And since 1999, we have had the privilege of having him chair the IU Center on Congress, which is a terrific educational mission that produces a wide variety of materials to help citizens better understand and become involved with Congress. He is an alum of our law school. And for those of you who have not checked out the Center of Congress, you can take a look at their website on the IU website and learn a lot from it. Paul Helmke, also an IU alum, formerly the Republican mayor of Fort Wayne for 3 terms, president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. He then became president of the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence from 2006 to 2011, and he's currently a professor of practice at SPIA and the founding director of the Civic Leaders Living Learning Center. Matt Pierce, next to Representative Hamilton, Democratic member of the Indiana House of Representatives, representing most of Bloomington since 2002. Also an IU alum with a BA in telecom and political science, as well as a law degree from Bloomington. Before he was elected to the legislature, he was a member of the Bloomington City Council for 6 years, and he's currently a lecturer in the IU Telecommunications Department. And Greg Knott, next to Matt, also an IU alum from SPIA, former chair of the Monroe County Libertarian Party. Greg notes that he tried running for office as a libertarian, but the fact that most Americans identify with one of the 2 major parties makes it hard for minor party candidates to raise money or gain name recognition and therefore votes. So he switched to the Republican Party, but he sees his libertarian views as a particular wing, the Ron Paul wing of the Republican Party, and not necessarily as a minority party. He believes liberty relies on owning one's own body and avoiding government interference without infringing on the rights of others. And currently, he is a local Republican vice precinct committeeman. Let me point out before we go any further, Indiana University brings remarkable people to Bloomington, and I am very grateful for that and very proud of it. And I'd also like to thank those who have sponsored this discussion. Move to amend the Bloomington chapter of a national coalition of organizations calling for a constitutional amendment stating that inalienable rights, including the right to free speech, belong to human beings only. Who would have thought we would have had to have asked about that? And that money is not a form of protected speech under the First Amendment and can be regulated. In addition, the American Constitution Society, our current law school chapter, the IU Civic Leaders Center in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, the IU Political and Civic Engagement Program in the college, Democracy for Monroe County, the League of Women Voters in Bloomington and Monroe County, the Libertarian Party of Monroe County. Please join me in thanking them for their sponsorship this evening. Okay, so what's the problem here? The sheer amount of campaign spending, $7 billion in 2012, sounds daunting, though I should tell you that it's only a small percentage of the amount Americans spend on pornography each year. And although this might be a subject for another interesting debate, the material we get about political candidates during campaigns may be more valuable to us as a society. But it's not just the sheer amount of campaign spending that should concern us. It's the huge increase in campaign spending in recent years and the sources of that increase. After a series of scandals during the Nixon re-election campaign in 1972, Congress passed the Federal Election Campaign Act amendments in 1974. That capped the amount that you and I and political groups can give directly to candidates. The point was to keep big money donors from buying favors, or at least access to federal candidates. And the Washington Watergate hearings showed that this was not just a theoretical concern. Congress unearthed memos from individuals and businesses stating in so many words, I will give you a contribution of $500,000 and you will in turn agree to drop the Justice Department's suit against my corporation. That part of the FECA, limits on contributions made directly to candidates, disclosure of the names of the donors, and public financing of presidential campaigns still stands, although the public funding of presidential campaigns is now so puny that no major candidate accepts it anymore. That part of our effort to regulate campaign finance has worked. We know a lot now about who gives money directly to candidates. Individuals can give only $2,700 directly to a federal candidate per election, which is not pocket change, but it's also not enough to buy a major favor in public policy either. So what hasn't worked? The big increase in campaign money can be traced to decisions by the United States Supreme Court. The first of those in 1976 said, Congress can limit how much you and I can give directly to a federal candidate. But if you or any political action committee want to spend $5 million on ads that attack or support a candidate for Congress or the presidency, that's your free speech right. In other words, as long as you don't give that money directly to a federal candidate, you can say essentially the same things that the candidate does in advertising that is supposed to be independent of the candidate's campaign, and you can spend unlimited funds on those ads. Now, you and I are probably not in any danger of spending millions on independent advertising in a federal campaign. It's kind of like the old adage that in the law, in its majestic equality, it forbids the rich and the poor alike from sleeping under bridges and begging in the streets. So that initial Supreme Court decision said that the right to free speech requires that both the rich and the poor be allowed to spend millions on campaign advertising if they choose, as long as it doesn't go through a candidate's campaign. Spending money on campaign communications raises concerns about corruption, that the money spent on advertising could lead to unequal access of citizens to government officials based on the amount of money that they put into a campaign. But the Supreme Court ruled that the right of Americans to be free from corruption in federal campaigns is trumped by our right to free speech. More recently, in 2010, the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United and a subsequent federal appeals court decision in the case of Speech Now, the court took that principle further by a 5-4 majority, which seems to be the pattern of the court these days. Remember that money comes into campaigns two ways. The money devoted directly to candidates, donated directly to them, and the money spent independently of a campaign, in theory, on ads that can mention a candidate, can even ask you to support or defeat her. Citizens United affected only the latter, the money spent independently of campaigns. But that's the conduit for campaign money that has grown the most. And some justices in that 5-member majority of the Supreme Court in Citizens United have hinted that they'd like to eliminate the ceilings on direct donations to candidates as well. Citizens United said, contrary to McCain-Feingold, corporations and labor unions have free speech rights in campaigns. They can run unlimited amounts of ads expressing their views on political issues and candidates, using money from their corporate and labor union treasuries close to the time of an election, 30 days before a primary, 60 days before the general election, the time that most of us are paying attention to the campaign. So what happened? In the next federal election in 2012, the amount of independent spending increased notably to over $1 million, and the increase was also substantial in 2014. We may be looking at $1 billion of independent spending in 2016. Most independent ads are negative ads. They're attack ads. It's not easy, however, for citizens to tell the difference between independent spending ads and those run by candidates. And many of the groups that sponsor these independent ads don't have to tell who gave them their money. These are the groups that are called 501c4s, who are allowed to spend unlimited amounts of undisclosed money on electioneering, as long as that adds up to half of their spending. The other half can be spent on educational activities, such as lobbying, for example. These 501c4 groups used to be primarily social welfare organizations like local volunteer fire departments. Now they're increasingly shadowy groups with vague titles, receiving multi-million-dollar donations from people whose names they don't have to make public. Were Citizens United and Speech Now responsible for these changes? Proving cause and effect is not easy, but when we see big increases in the type of spending that was not permitted before Citizens United, we have reason to suspect a relationship. That's certainly the case with 501c4 groups. So let's turn to our speakers and see what they have to say about this. And here are some of the issues that we need to talk about. What's freedom of speech and who gets it? Freedom of speech is a fundamental American right under the Constitution that we take more seriously than most other democracies do. But what has to happen for you and me to exercise that right? You and me can say lots of things in this room, but nobody outside this room will hear us. The Supreme Court said in 1976, in one of the outstanding political ironies of our time, I think, that to really exercise your free speech right, you need to spend money. You need to purchase media. You need to purchase advertising. But it seems pretty clear that in a democracy where voters are guaranteed equal voice in elections through their votes, a system of free speech that requires access to costly media is an unusual understanding of freedom of speech. Second, what's the relationship between campaign spending and political influence? James Madison wrote that one of the major sources of disagreement within any democracy is going to be people's differences in socioeconomic status, their levels of wealth, their sources of wealth. Madison said the best assurance we've got of maintaining a democratic system, given that inevitable disagreement, is to disperse the power among various parts of the government and levels of the government. Separation of governing power, formation of lots of special interests that would then counterbalance one another. Madison didn't promise that this would always work. He just said this was our best shot. But is there a point at which a system of almost unregulated campaign spending just makes it too hard for some groups, those with less wealth and fewer other advantages, to counterbalance the power of groups with more resources? We've got good research showing that public policy decisions are more likely to resemble the preferences of those with a great deal of money than to resemble the preferences of anybody else in American society. We've got good research to show that income inequality has increased quite a bit in the past 3 decades, more in the United States than it has in most other major Western democracies. And finally, what can we do about it? There are a number of possible avenues here. This is not an unsolvable problem. So let's ask the members of the panel for their views. And let me start with Greg Knott.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I just want to start with a little disclaimer. Personally, I'm for the move to amend. I've signed up my support on the petition, and I'm on the email list, and I've even attended a meeting or two locally. But what I want to offer tonight is some concerns I have with it, and kind of a libertarian critique. I'll just start out with some of the basic questions as I see them. Should corporations have legal status as a separate entity so that, for example, in a civil suit, you don't have to name each shareholder as a defendant? And I would say yes, corporations should have that status legally. And to my knowledge, Move to Amend agrees with that. They don't seek to change that legal status. So I think that's a good thing. The next question I would have is, should corporations have constitutional protections that were originally intended for natural persons? In other words, non-government created entities. And I don't think that corporations should have constitutional protections. And I don't think there's anything in libertarianism that says that corporations or nonprofits or unions should have those kind of constitutional protections. So in that respect, I think the reform that's before Congress that I'd probably be even more in support of than the Move to Amendment is one that's called HJ Resolution 21. It's sponsored by Jim McGovern, and the Senate version is sponsored by John Tester and Tom Udall, and it would revoke corporate constitutional rights if passed and ratified by the states. I would prefer that one because it doesn't take on the issue of campaign contributions as political speech. It just kind of cleanly removes constitutional corporate rights. So then the next question we have is money speech? There's probably a wide number of opinions on that, but I would say money isn't speech, but just like money isn't travel or religion, but a law that restricted your ability to spend money on cars and churches would still directly infringe on your freedom to move about freely and to worship as you please. So I think money is directly related to political speech, even if you think maybe it's not political speech itself. another thing I'd like to say about that is that the notion that individuals only have a right to speech that doesn't cost money is fairly illogical. The McCain-Feingold campaign finance law was so broad that it would, by the government's own admission, allow the government to ban political books, pamphlets, along with movies, TV ads, radio spots, yard signs, and billboards within 30 days of an election. If that's not censorship of political speech, what is that? Imagine similar restrictions on the freedom of press. Imagine you could own a newspaper, but the government restricted how much money you could spend in distributing that newspaper and limited the reach with which you could distribute your newspaper. I think newspaper owners would rightly see that as a violation of their First Amendment rights. Here's a quote from Cato scholar Trevor Burrus. He says that the critics will respond that the resolution only regulates political spending, not political speech. This is one of the biggest pieces of piffle in modern political discourse. If regulating and drying up spending didn't affect any political speech, then the reformers wouldn't even want to do it. Rather than continuing to repeat that tired old line, Senator Al Franken and other amendment supporters should come out and say precisely what they believe, that their view of good government requires giving them broad power to censor political speech. Here's another quote. This one's by libertarian Murray Rothbard. He says that all rights are property rights. The right to free speech is the right to be able to dispose of your body and your belongings for the purpose of expression. It's the right to acquire products or services for purposes of expression, whether that means buying ink by the barrel or 30 seconds of airtime during Monday Night Football. So I'd like to move on to a few practical concerns and possibly unintended consequences of move to amend. Number one, political campaigns are very expensive. And I know when I ran for Congress as a libertarian, my opponents spent millions of dollars. So it's not as if just anyone can run. You have to either be independently wealthy already, or you have to be able to raise large chunks of money quickly. So if we do make it more difficult to raise money in large chunks, are we creating a barrier to entry for less wealthy candidates? So a practical example of that might be in the presidential primary. Many of you are aware of Rick Santorum and how basically just one casino owner, Sheldon Adelson, supported through a super PAC, kept Rick Santorum alive in the presidential primary. And believe me, I am no fan of Rick Santorum, and probably many of us aren't. But if that wasn't the case, what are we doing? We're saying that he's probably not going to be able to compete, and only people like Donald Trump and Michael Bloomberg with great personal wealth would be able to self-fund their own campaigns. I think that's kind of leveling or making the playing field less level, and probably something we wouldn't want to do, is to limit public service to only wealthy individuals. Something else that struck me as kind of odd is there's a court case that did away with the aggregate limits on the contributions to individual candidates. It's called McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, and the court's conclusion was I thought common sense. The original law limited an individual to contributing the legal maximum to just 18 candidates. If the first 18 aren't corrupted by the contribution, what changes with that 19th candidate? What automatically makes that corruption? It just seems very arbitrary, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense there. Another point I'd like to bring up is does money automatically mean success for a candidate. I think we'd all agree that it doesn't. Just an example here recently, in the 2014 election, the majority leader of Congress, Eric Cantor, got beat in a primary, and he spent $4.9 million, and his opponent spent $123,000. So it's about a 40 to 1. He got outspent, but he still won. In fact, it was widely reported that Eric Cantor spent more on steak dinners at Washington steakhouses than his opponent spent on his entire campaign. So there's definitely a point of diminishing returns on political spending, and even if it is used wisely, that doesn't necessarily guarantee success. One idea I thought may have merit was rather than limiting political contributions, which may fall into a gray area, that may be considered political speech or limiting political speech by a lot of people. Why not tax the political contributions and use their revenue to help candidates who voluntarily agree to limit their campaign spending in return for that public funding? I think there's kind of some form of that in the presidential races already. If you agree to limits, then you get some public funding in return for agreeing to those limits. So maybe that could be extended to other federal offices like the U.S. House and U.S. Senate and so forth. Another concern I had is limiting campaign contributions. Is that really addressing the root problem, or is that really more addressing symptoms of the root problem? I would see the root problem is that our government is way outside the constitutional bounds. It's involved in too many areas, so that creates an incentive for people to try and influence government and to try and basically have a legal bribe to divvy up government goodies. So if we're constraining government to its original functions under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which enumerates very specific powers, then maybe there'd be less of a need for campaign finance restrictions. And another thing I wanted to mention was the Fight Washington Corruption Pledge. That's various reforms that were put out by MoveOn.org. And when I ran for Congress, I was the only candidate in the race that signed that pledge. But it has really common sense things in it that would be a lot easier to pass than a constitutional amendment. For example, it kind of slowed down that revolving door between congressional offices, be it the congressmen themselves or their staffers, going to K Street and the lobbyists, and also kind of slowed down the lobbyists going into public service in congressional offices. So there's a lot of reforms like that would probably be easier to pass and also do a lot of good things. So with that, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Now that we're underway, let me mention that the ushers have cards for you in which you can write questions that you would like to submit to the panelists. So if you would like a card and are thinking about a question, why don't you raise your hand now, and our energetic folks will come and get you one. And I will ask you for those questions at the time we finish. Okay, now we are going to hear from Professor Paul Helmke.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And this is a complicated, messy topic. And I think one of the things that concerns me most is that it's such a mess that it discourages people from running. I've always felt we need more people running for office. And my hat's off to anyone who runs, this entire panel, former Mayor Allison I see, a former Mayor and State Rep Bailey and Congressional candidate Bailey, current mayoral candidate John Hamilton. I'm sure there's other candidates out here. We need more people running for office, not less. But the way campaign finance rules work in all sorts of different areas, I think, discourage people from running for office. They're either afraid they're not going to be able to raise the money, or they're afraid that someone's going to spend a ton of money against them, or they're afraid they're going to have so many rules about the money that they're going to trip up and get in trouble regardless. Just sort of if you've watched the IU Student Association elections in town, I'm a former student body president, so I follow them. They were crazy this year. I mean, it's, and I know there's, they have a system where if you have infractions, people claim infractions against the other ticket, and then you get a percent of your votes deducted, which is an interesting concept when you think about it. But then if you violate the spending limits with a pony and T-shirts or whatever, you're disqualified totally. And I don't know what the lesson is for the rest of us in real politics, but this is a tricky business. It's hard to come up with the rules. Just real quickly, this isn't exactly money. One of the reasons I first got elected mayor was an claimed campaign violation on my part. My opponent actually had some real ones 4 years earlier, but when I was running, my campaign manager said, let's get yard signs. And I'm thinking, yard signs, waste of money, people don't do yard signs. I mean, I see yard signs in Bloomington, but in Fort Wayne, you put the money into TV, so people don't do yard signs. And he wanted to do this starting like in June, and I kind of said, well, if you think it's the right thing. Next thing I know, we've got yard signs out, and there's an article in the paper that I have violated a campaign rule in the city by having yard signs out too early. And I thought, great, I didn't want these stupid yard signs in the first place, and now we're violating some rule that I didn't know about. And then I got looking at the rule, and I used to do First Amendment law, represented one of the newspapers in the city. And I thought, if I want to put a sign in my own yard with my name on it, I should be able to, and so should my neighbor if they want to. Now, I can understand not in the public right of way and all that sort of thing. You have a right to do that. So I said, we're not taking our signs down. Well, it went from some lower level, administrator up to the next level, up to the plan department guy, up to the community development guy, up to the deputy chief of staff, up to the mayor, as this thing got fought out in courts. And it was great. It was, I didn't have any money, other than to buy yard signs, apparently. I was doing neighborhood walks, though, every night, the retail campaigning, which is what we need more of, too. And people started to say, oh, I saw your ad on TV, Humpke. And I thought, I don't have any money for ads on TV. What they saw was that day's story about the latest move in the courts and the system about my yard signs. And of course, television being television, they would focus in on my nice blue sign, Humpke for mayor, and then they'd have the story. So people thought I was getting it just off the topic, but it just shows how complicated this area is. Quickly, one of the things I hear from some people when I listen to these debates is there's not a problem. I mean, George Will likes to talk about how much we spend. I don't think he uses pornography, but George Will likes to talk about how much Americans spend on bubble gum or potato chips or whatever, and how that's tons more than we spend on politics, and why should we worry? And that's a legitimate point. Other people, like our speaker that last fall when we had the debate on Citizens United, Jim Bopp, made the case that really this incumbents have such advantages anyway that allowing the more spending by corporations or whoever is just a way to balance out the thing. That this is sort of an anti-incumbent type act. Actually, all the money goes to the incumbents most of the time, but it's so there's this theory too. So a lot of people don't think there's a problem, but I think anybody who's been in the political business or who has been around the political business knows that there are real problems with this. Might not know what the solutions are, but knows there's the problems. And I think the problems are basically three. I think there is a true effect on the candidate. It's one of the raising money for anything is tough. A cause, a dance marathon, whatever. Raising money when you're running for office, you really do feel slimy. It's just every time you make that phone call, and your campaign managers and the consultants, they've got you in making calls all the time. You always know you don't say it, But you can tell they're the person on the other end of the line. 90% of the time is what's in it for me, is what they're thinking. And they're thinking that, and hopefully they're not saying that because you don't want to be illegal and they don't want to be illegal. But you just have this feeling that you're selling out somewhat. It's a necessary evil, but it's a slimy business. Luckily, I've got a bad memory. I forget who gave me money most of the time. So but it is the process is disgusting. And what's really bad is how much of it has to go on. A few years ago, when they were having one of the periodic campaign scandals in Washington, I think it was supposedly that Al Gore was making phone calls from the phone in his office in the White House. To me, the true tragedy was how much time candidates, elected officials, spent making those phone calls. I mean, the sad thing about Washington is you got this beautiful Capitol building, and during silly season, election season, which is almost full time now, all those candidates leave their offices, they leave the Capitol building, they leave the House and Senate office buildings, and they run to these little cubicles that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have within a block where they make phone calls, raising money. And that's what they need to do all the time, to raise the money to do this. And it's estimated sometimes that these electeds are spending 1/3 of their time, minimum, raising money. If we elect them to do our work, the public's work, they ought to be doing the public's work, not spending all their time raising money. It's just, the counter to that is, well, if we had unlimited spending, then they'd only have to make one phone call instead of 100. But it's the amount of time you spend raising money really, I think, puts the public's business and the public agenda at risk. So there is a true effect on the candidate, and that effect carries through even once you're in office, because you realize if it's been a real big contributor, this person lets you know when they're unhappy. They let you know they don't expect any variation from what you said before, and that even if you've been convinced by hearing the debate, by listening to your constituents, by seeing new research on an issue, they don't care. You've got to toe their line, the money line, and that's something that makes it tough to really do the public's business the way we expect our electeds to do the business. So there's a true effect on the candidate. I think there's also an effect on the voter. The voter, when they're hearing these messages, they're hearing untruths. They don't know the hidden agendas. The disclosure procedures don't really tell you who this group is. All the names sound wonderful. The power, there is a lot of power in the media, and it's the old Justice Holmes's line about, we expect truth to triumph in the marketplace of ideas, but in the marketplace of toothpaste, the guy that spends the most money usually gets the market share. In the marketplace of idea, the person who has the most money is oftentimes going to come out ahead. That's who the voter is going to listen to. When I think about running for office again, which it's in remission right now. Hopefully it'll stay that way. One of the things that occurs to me, if I ran the Brady Center to prevent gun violence for 5 years, if the NRA wanted to come in and keep me from running for city council or dog catcher in Fort Wayne, they could probably beat me. I mean, people still like me, I think, but when you have tons of money, and unlimited money, basically, you can probably beat almost anyone that's out there. You might not be able to elect someone you want, but you can probably beat someone that's out there. And that's sort of a scary thing. The other thing really, and this is sort of, again, how it's complicated and how to solve these things, the coordination factor. Yeah. Do they really coordinate? It's the guy that used to be your chief of staff or used to run your last campaign is the one that's now running the independent thing. But even when there is true non-coordination, that's kind of scary too. What if somebody's out there attacking my opponent on things that I don't agree with? What if they're saying things about me that I don't support? How does the public, how does the voter know what Helmke really stands for, what Helmke's opponent stands for? In some way, it makes it even messier. The private sector, the private spenders, in effect, are taking over the campaigns. And it's no longer the candidate that can even clarify or justify what's been said. So, effect on the candidate, effect on the voter. Lastly, there's an effect on the political system. And I think that's the most serious. It's something that, as Professor Hershey said, most of the money is on negative ads. And you think about it, they usually do work. All the consultants tell you they work. But, they think about it. If McDonald's ran their campaigns on don't eat at Wendy's, you'll get sick, or if Delta said don't fly U.S. Air, you'll crash. Eventually, they'd get greater market share, but eventually no one would go to fast food joints and no one would fly airplanes, and I think go on airplanes. And that's what's happening, is we're running all these negative ads, and eventually people are just tuning out of politics, and no one is voting, no one is participating. I think that's sad. Hard part is it also leads to the polarization. You're getting the people that elected are just coming from the extremes, and that's bad for the system too. We don't have people in the middle that are trying to solve problems. I'm running out of time, but just real quick, solutions are the hard part. To me, we need to focus in on the First Amendment. What is the First Amendment all about? There was a great article in the Atlantic last month called "The Embattled First Amendment," and really sort of saying we need to look at what is the purpose of the First Amendment. It's not just speech, because we like to hear people prattle on like I'm doing. It's because speech is to help us get where we want to learn about the issues in front of us and the alternatives. So we need to talk about why do we have a First Amendment. We need to talk about who should be able to claim First Amendment rights. I really do question corporations claiming the First Amendment rights the way they do. I think we need to talk about where we're looking at the First Amendment. I think one possibility still is, we still have governmental regulation over the airwaves. So maybe allow any spending that's going on in the newspapers and other places. But when we can regulate the airwaves, let's do something about television and those things, the cable messages that come in. At least for a few more years, people probably are going to watch TV before it's all on the internet. But let's figure out what can be regulated and try to figure out some way to regulate it. And I think that's got, part of it's got to be perhaps we need true public financing for more and more elections, so those folks who are challenging the incumbents can get their word out. Again, the dangers are out there. The more rules you write, the more ways money tries to get around those rules, the more ways people try to influence the system. I've heard some people argue we had a lot better campaign system prior to 1974, when there basically was unlimited spending and no rules. We elected decent people most of the time. Sometimes they were stolen elections, but you still had the elections. Bottom line, we do have a problem. Bottom line, I think we need to find a solution, and hopefully panels like this and people like you will be part of solving that. So thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. I do feel the need to point out at this point that we have so far had 3 people in an academic building, none of whom has gone over their allotted time. We may be setting a record here, so now we'll see if Matt Pierce can keep it going. This is Representative Matt Pierce.
You better tell me what my limit is so I can pay attention.
Hell of an introduction. Sorry about that, Matt.
Well, there is no doubt that anytime you're dealing with the First Amendment and people's right of free speech, you have to be very careful, and you have to craft things very delicately so you don't end up having less exchange of ideas rather than more. But I think that we're smart enough to do that, and we can make things work. But when you look at Citizens United from the perspective of a legislature and someone who's involved in state campaigns, I mean, the first thing that really does come to mind is just the very concept of a corporation as kind of like an individual who should have these speech rights. And that's really, the first and maybe biggest problem with Citizens United, because I first learned the term legal fiction in this very building as a law student, right? And they said sometimes it's convenient to kind of make up a lie and go along with it to facilitate things under the law. So one of the legal fictions is, okay, let's treat corporations as people for the purpose of facilitating commerce and allowing these entities to exist that can bring people together to basically do capitalism. And if we have to sue them because they're disputes, it's just easier to say, okay, they're people. And so we got this legal fiction, and it didn't work too badly in the world of commerce, and dealing with business type things. But now, with Citizens United and then later the Hobby Lobby case, we're now saying that these corporations, have the same rights or the same types of entities as humans, as people. And so now we're imputing to them not just actual ideas they want to articulate through speech as this kind of legal fiction, but we now also say they have religious beliefs and faiths and ways to actually observe their religious beliefs as a corporation or business entity. And that's what got the legislature in such big problems with this whole RFRA debate, right? Because we took a law from the 90s that was designed to ensure individuals could freely exercise their religion without being unduly burdened by the government, unless there was a really, really, really good reason for the government to kind of get in the way of their religious observances. And so then when you take that, and now you scale it up to a corporation, I mean, that just brings a whole new dimension to things. People are doing business. So in the speech world, just as in this issue about religious beliefs of corporations, it just raises a question. You know, who is speaking? Is it the chief executive officer who decides what the corporation's political views are? Is it the board of directors? Is it a vote of all the employees of the corporation? Is it all the shareholders who get to decide which candidates will be supported and which bills in Congress should be supported? You know, it's hard to know who's actually making that decision within the corporation. And so some people have suggested maybe one way you could get at the Citizen United decision without having to get into some of the constitutional problems is just really have some legal rules about how corporations are going to decide what their positions are. Maybe they have to have shareholder votes. Maybe there has to be some more formal system rather than maybe just having a CEO make a decision. The other major damaging problem with Citizen United and New World we live in are the 501c4s. The ability to basically launder your money through these organizations so you can't tell who's actually talking. Because one of the things that's really important in politics is to kind of know who's talking. And essentially, the Federal Communications Commission decided the same thing back in the 20s with radio. They said if somebody is trying to sell you a product, you should kind of know who's talking to you. You know, if you say Tide is great, you should kind of know it's Tide talking. So you have to have these sponsorship tags. If it's not readily apparent to you that it's, you know, Procter & Gamble talking about Tide, there needs to be a little disclaimer down there about, you know, who paid for this ad? Who's talking to me? And that's because they recognize that you can help size up the biases of the people talking to you and maybe do a little bit of a job of processing that information. You can't do that when you have these groups that pop up with these great sounding names and you can't tell where the money's come from. And they are the ones who, as mentioned, they can make kind of the negative attacks and really do the nasty work on candidates. And then the candidate who's being assisted by those negative attacks, he can disclaim all of it. And it is pretty darn easy to have coordination because if you look, you've got people who've worked on a campaign suddenly go off and work for the 501c4. Anybody who really does politics can kind of just monitor the race and kind of figure out what needs to be done and maybe what the strategy is they can see unfolding. So you get things like swift boating of John Kerry. You get a whole separate group pop up and create a whole narrative about a candidate. And if the other candidate benefits from that, they can say, I got nothing to do with that. That's just somebody expressing their First Amendment rights. And that kind of came up in the state race, and that after our last governor's race, it was an interesting race because it ended up being a lot closer than anybody thought it would be. And in fact, Governor Pence, who won the election, came in under 50% of the vote, which is a little bit unusual. He had a libertarian candidate peeling off some votes. But a lot of people said, gee, if the Democratic candidate had just, you know, spent a little bit more money or had a little more money to spend to drive his point home, or maybe was a little stronger in comparing the differences between his ideas and the governor's ideas, he probably could have pulled out those 4 or 5% that he needed and been over the top. And it was interesting because a lot of people at the State House said, like, no, that would never worked. Because if he were to really like pour it on the coals in the final weeks of the campaign, and if they would have seen the gap closing, what would have happened is you would have the 501c4s rush in and just pound the challenger who's beginning to pick up some momentum. And you might remember that Governor Pence made a very big thing of saying, like, I'm going to run a clean campaign and never say a negative thing about my opponent, which is commendable, but you can keep that pledge if you know, without even having to ask for it, somebody's waiting in the wings deciding if they need to go negative and be very harsh and overwhelm the other side, they're there to do it. And so that creates problems. And then you just cannot doubt the impact of media spending. I mean, I think television audiences are getting very fragmented. We have hundreds of choices, and we can go watch stuff on the internet. And so it's not quite like the old days of 3 networks dominating everything and having 4 choices of what to watch on television, which some of us are old enough to actually remember those days. And so you don't quite have the all-encompassing power of television, but it's still a pretty powerful player in the process. And one of the things I do in my day job, as was mentioned, is I'm a lecturer over in the telecom department, and I teach a media history class, and I go out to the National Archives every year and troll through complaint letters to the FCC from the 20s and 30s and 40s, kind of that golden age of radio. And I ran across an interesting thing from the very early days of radio. They had a big debate about whether you should really allow broadcasters to have what were called direct advertising, where you basically say, you know, buy this toothpaste, and you'd really do the hard sell. They really, in the beginning, wanted to be what they called indirect advertising, which would be like public TV. You'd only be allowed to say the Lucky Strike cigarette people brought you this big band orchestra in the beginning and the end. They wanted to be like soft sell. But as we know, that we evolved into kind of the direct advertising hard sell world. But it was interesting that there was this little small Iowa town, and their Chamber of Commerce passed a resolution and sent it to the FCC, and it got in the newspaper. And they basically said that in the early days of radio, they could tell that the radio advertising was so powerful, it could drive sales so much that they thought it should be banned because it would be unfair, because any business that cannot afford to buy those radio ads, that would be stuck with the old-fashioned newspaper, they'd be at this severe disadvantage. And so to them, the answer was to ban direct advertising from radio broadcasting to keep it fair. So that just gives you some sense of the power, and that's even before we added pictures later with television. So you can really see the power that's there. So what tends to happen, at least in legislative races, is you kind of track the races, and usually there are about 12 of the 100 House races that are really the key races in the swing districts, or places where you've got a competitive race going on. And what we see from the Democratic perspective is we will be able to raise just enough money to kind of do the bare minimum you need to do to get on TV to communicate. And we'll be moving along pretty well, and the candidate will be right in the thick of it. Maybe they're up by 2 or 3 points, maybe down by 3 or 4 points, margin of error. It's looking good. They're working hard on the ground. They're knocking on doors. They're doing all that kind of stuff. And then in that last about 3 weeks of the election, it's like bombers coming over and just unloading and carpet bombing you. And the TV ads will go up, and it's just these negative attacks, and the direct mail begins to hit, and it can come from these outside groups, and they just basically destroy the candidate. And in the next 3 weeks, by the time you get to the election, they'll lose by 10 or 15 points. Just kind of wiped out. And that's because you have this imbalance of financing. You know, one side can only execute their basic plan and hope that it's enough to get them across the finish line. The other side has a tremendous ability to raise this money and to really make it work. So while, yes, there are instances where you can win elections through hard work, you don't necessarily always win because you have the most money, but I would argue you probably win most of the time when you have the largest amount of money. And that then, because politicians know that, opens the door to corruption with a small c. Now, I can tell you that most everyone I've encountered in the political process, elective office, are very honorable people. And I've never seen anybody with a big, suitcase show up and say, here's some cash, vote my way. So I don't think it's a corrupt institution in the sense of kind of legal corruption, like people are taking bribes. But there is kind of corruption with a small c. Because in the back of your mind, you know that you're going to need a significant amount of money in the next election if you want to remain in office yourself, if you're in one of those targeted races. And if you want to pick up seats to build your majority or gain a majority, you're going to need that money. And you can see that undue influence really lurking within the system. Now, this is one of my criticisms of the Supreme Court, is that I think since Sandra Day O'Connor left, she was actually in the legislature, there's nobody there who's ever run for anything or has any practical political experience. There are all these great Ivy Leaguers, who are, I'm sure, are excellent legal minds, but they don't know what the practical world of politics is. They have no idea. And I think that's part of the problem. And so you can really see this in the RFRA controversy that kicked up, because the Republicans started out passing a bill to ingratiate themselves with the social conservative base of their party. And that was their main goal. and they wanted to shore them up and make sure they were there despite their disappointment over the Republicans having not pushed the marriage amendment in the previous session. So they passed that bill, and then you get this tremendous amount of blowback, which nobody quite anticipated. National, international blowback, extreme pressure. So now the Republicans are really kind of stuck because they've got the corporate world, they've got the business people, they've got the Chamber of Commerce, the tourism people all saying, you're killing us here, you're hurting our business, you're hurting our jobs, you're killing the economy, you got to do something about this. So now they have this choice they have to make. Okay, who do I satisfy now? Do I satisfy my social conservative base who have great sway in primary elections, or do I satisfy the corporate people who have the money to fund my campaigns? And the interesting thing to me is I thought they would never be able to decide that question. I thought it'd be complete gridlock and mayhem, but you know what? They all lined up in short order and they took care of the funders. The business people won, the corporate people won that battle. Because, you could tell they were probably saying, like, if you're going to be doing this kind of stuff to us, we can't be, helping you out in the next election. And I think that pretty clearly illustrates how the money matters. Because they had to choose, they didn't want to make the choice, but they had to do it. So I'll just end with this one last point, too, is the other thing that concerns me is not only do you have the ability of kind of the corporate side, the business side, to really have an outsized impact on the money through these 501c4s as well as with their more direct contributions, but there's a systematic effort to undermine the ability of working people and their kind of natural institutions of support to participate with money in the process. And so things that we've seen passed recently, like right to work, this so-called right to work bill, which essentially said that the union could not require some fair shared payments for services they provide the members, even if they choose not to join a union. Right now, we're days away from eliminating something called a common construction wage, or it's called prevailing wage in other places, which ensures that construction workers get a decent living wage. And most of those workers are labor. They're members of organized labor and building trades. And what that's really all about is if you can weaken labor unions and get to the point where the law says there's no reason to join. Teachers is another example. They took away almost all the collective bargaining rights of teachers as public employees. And what they're really trying to do is they want to get to the point where everyone basically who's in a union now is like, why am I bothering to pay dues and belonging to this organization? They can't do much bargaining for me. They're highly marginalized. And so what does that mean? The one entity that has the ability to kind of play like the corporations could, the organized labor side, their resources are shrinking. And so you're going to end up fairly soon, I think, at the rate we're going, with just a completely unbalanced system. And that explains why we get some of the results that we get. And with that, I hope I didn't mess it up and go over my time.
Matt, you've kept our string going. I'm very proud of you for that. And let me introduce Representative Lee Hamilton.
Margie, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. You made a very excellent statement on the status of the law earlier, and I appreciated that very much. I'm very pleased to be here with several friends. I was just recently in Fort Wayne. They said the finest mayor Fort Wayne ever had was Paul Helmke.
Thank you.
And I knew that anyway, of course, Paul. I want to express my apologies for walking out to get a couple of calls done. But you had talked about the tricky business, the slimy business, and the disgusting process. I got the drift of your comments. And I come down pretty much the same side you do as I move along here. I just met Greg here this evening. I'm delighted to get to know him. Greg, I began in politics polling a precinct. And believe you me, I've got a lot of respect for anybody who serves as a precinct committeeman, and it's good to see you. And of course, Matt has a marvelous record. He's one of 29 Democrats in 100 House. Boy, oh boy, what a ratio you're battling there. I've been in the minority for a few years in my experience in the legislature, but nothing like that, I can assure you. So I admire your efforts on behalf of the 29 in the House. Let me begin with my conclusions. Campaign finance reform is an issue that we ignore at our peril. Money is poisoning the system. People lose faith today in the political process because of the role of money in elections, and I believe money now threatens the core values that define our nation. We may have a bit of a bias in this audience. From my point of view, money has become a threat to representative democracy. So you know where I come from. The first point I want to make is the perception gap that exists about political money. On the one hand, Americans generally, the polls show, believe that money has a very pernicious impact on the political process. That's poll after poll shows that. On the other hand, those that are closest to the system, politicians, do not believe that. And so you have this huge gap in perceptions. Most voters think that campaign money buys results. Many sarcastically say we've got the best money that Congress can buy. Most Americans are very wary about the impact of money on the process. But spend a little time talking to the politicians, not Matt Pierce. When it comes to those most closely involved in the system, you get a very different perception. Most members of Congress spend a lot of time chasing after campaign contributions, and they consider it a task that is annoying, but they do not believe that it's corrupting. They don't believe that they are selling their votes. They do not believe that money influences their behavior. Sit down and look a member of Congress in the eye, and he or she will tell you in all sincerity that they cannot be bought. They cannot be influenced by money. I have never met a politician who thought that he or she was corruptible. Money may or may not be corrupting. We've discussed that a little bit here. Capital C, small c, good distinction. But it does provide donors and lobbyists with disproportionate access and influence. Money diminishes the power of the ordinary voter. If the donor has more influence, you have less. Money overwhelms the political process. It drowns out the voice of the ordinary voter. Now, we've got a tidal wave of money coming into our elections, and I don't see any end in sight. Each successive election sees an increase, a big increase, Margie, you mentioned this, a big increase in the amount of money spent by candidates. And now in recent years, most of that money is what we call dark money, with no disclosure as to from where it comes, from whom it comes, and with very minimal oversight. I do not believe that members of Congress sell votes to the highest bidder routinely. Most of them raise money from political interests that they're already aligned with. And I don't think many politicians change their votes because of money. but there isn't any doubt in my mind that money has a powerful impact. Let me give you a quick, simple illustration, very simple. I walk into my office 10 o'clock in the morning. The secretary says, Lee, you've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes to make 25 calls. Here's a list of the 25 calls. A number of them are from people who are asking for Social Security check being delivered or mail being delivered on time or whatever the concern is. And several of them are from big donors. Now, whose phone call do I return? You see the pressures that operate in very simple ways on legislators. Money undermines faith in the Congress. It encourages the notion that Congress does not represent the interests of the people. Money cripples representative democracy. There's all kinds of ample evidence to show that where the majority and the wealthy disagree, the influence of money outweighs the views of the ordinary voter. There's a lot of evidence to show that the opinions of average citizens have little, if any, impact on policy. There's a lot of evidence to show that the opinions of the big donors have a strong correlation with the policy changes that take place. We're doing a lot of research now in this area, and the evidence is pretty overwhelming. The implications of all of this for representative democracy are deeply troubling. Now, to some extent, you could argue that this has always been the case, but it has become much more prevalent, money has become much more prevalent and powerful for the reasons my colleagues have mentioned in today's political system. It purchases attack ads that saturate the airwaves, Matt referred to this, without giving a clue where the money is coming from. It buys ads that drown out other voices and sometimes drowns out the voices of the candidates themselves. It takes our politics in extreme directions, emphasizing ideological purity, excessive partisanship, and confrontation. Now, it also diverts the energy of the politician. We've said here before, money does not guarantee a win. Of course, that's right. You can spend an awful lot of money in politics and still get beat, and many do. But the absence of money will almost always assure a loss. It's very, very tough in this country today to run a competitive campaign unless you have access to money, either your own or somebody else. Now, working in the legislature and the Congress is a complicated business. The job requires taking on all kinds of commitments, research, personal contacts, building relationships, researching legislation, meeting with constituents, incessant travel. It just goes on and on and on. The to-do list on your legal pad is never, ever completed. All of this puts a huge stress on the time of a legislator or politician. And the requirement that you have to spend a lot of time raising money diverts you from all kinds of other important tasks that you ought to be doing. If you go to Washington and you drop into a member's office at 11 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, they almost certainly will tell you the member is not available to see you, but they don't tell you where the member is. Where the member is over at the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee, dialing people across the country trying to raise money. I've done it myself. It's a very humiliating task. I think it's humiliating for the donor as well. I know it's humiliating for the guy that has to raise the money. Now, something new is on the corner, on the horizon, and that is the super PACs. the super PACs have become such enormous players in recent months, not years, months. All the big candidates are using them. Their top staff is moving to the super PACs. The super PACs, which used to be focused on raising money for television ads, have now become major actors in every single campaign. These super PACs get around all of the limits, all of them. Unlimited amounts of money can be devoted to a campaign. They can collect money from anybody, any institution. They are now playing larger and larger roles in every campaign. Voter turnout, direct mail, digital, micro-targeting. Campaigns are becoming enormously sophisticated. You have to have extraordinary talent today to run a big campaign, and it takes a lot of money to pay for the people that have that talent. It's gone long beyond the polling of the precincts that I used to do, and you may still do, Greg. Now, Marjorie's given us an excellent example, statement with regard to the law. I'm going to skip over all of that. I've got some statements about it. But what do we know after all of these cases you mentioned have come through? What do we know? We know that since these cases have been decided, our ability to see who is contributing to a campaign has been sharply diminished. You can't find out. I was talking the other day to a New York Times reporter, a name some of you would know, a friend of mine for decades. And he was telling me that even he, with the resources of the New York Times, was having trouble finding out who the contributors were to some major campaigns in this country. Now, if a Times reporter cannot find out who's contributing the money, what chance do you and I have of finding out? Okay, what do you do about all of this? There are two things that I'd mention very quickly that are possible steps towards remedy. One is disclosure. The Supreme Court has endorsed the course of action. Justice Kennedy put it pretty well. Quote, prompt, get the word prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the needed information to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions. Okay. The court is very clearly on record in support of prompt disclosure. There was a time when I thought everybody favored disclosure. No more. Disclosure has a lot of opponents today. There is intense opposition to disclosure, and even those who favor disclosure don't always pay attention to Justice Kennedy's first word, prompt. If I get disclosure as to who contributed to campaign X 6 months after the election, who cares? It's ancient history. Disclosure only counts if you have it immediately, before the votes are cast. It has to be timely, so that the citizen can match the votes of their representatives with their vote immediately. Now, disclosure then is not easy, and we have a lot of opposition to it. My own view is I'm for almost any kind of disclosure you can think of, promptly. We cannot rely on the United States Congress to pass a disclosure bill. I wish we could. We can't rely on the United States Congress to do anything on campaign finance reform in the near term. There are several pretty good bills that have been introduced, and they have gotten nowhere. Not even a hearing. Congress is out of the picture at this point in time. I hope it'll change with regard to a remedy to campaign finance. Where do you turn? Well, I'm not sure. It may be the FEC, which has been basically an utter disaster, offers some hope, but not very much. It may be the IRS can help. I don't know, really. It may be the FCC can help bring about stricter disclosure rules, but all of this, I must say, to me is a bit of a mystery at this point. It may be that the White House could issue an executive order. I don't know whether they're considering that or not. That might be helpful. But the dark money just keeps increasing dramatically. The Supreme Court's vision of disclosure and transparency is nowhere in sight. Nowhere. And we are now in a time when elections are becoming dominated by dark money. Donors hide in the shadows. Hundreds of millions of dollars are flowing through the political system today without a trace of who gave it or why. So I think disclosure is part of the answer, but I don't know how to get it done under present circumstances. Secondly, and I'll conclude here, public financing. I used to have a lot of public meetings. Money in politics would come up frequently. And they'd ask, well, Lee, what do you think about it? And I said, I favor public money. I usually got out of town without being tarred and feathered, but not always. Congress is not exactly the most popular institution in America today. Spending money for a politician's campaign sounds, if you want a hard sell, that's it. I think we ought to have it. It's not a lot of money, of course, in terms of the total budget. But if you want, and it has to be done right, it has to be done with matching funds, and there are all kinds of suggestions there. Candidates have to agree to certain restrictions if they accept that money. But if you want to begin to try to restore some kind of balance between competing ideologies, competing visions of what we ought to be doing in this country, I think this is the way you have to go, but we're not going to get there for a long, long time as far as I can see. There are other kinds of proposals to cap limitations on TV and require broadcasters to do certain things, but I think those things are not likely. So, my two remedies are disclosure and public funding. Neither do I see, I don't see much chance for either one of them in the near term. And on that ringing note of optimism.
It's such a pleasure to hear the clear voice of Lee Hamilton. We would love to have your questions. We would love to have them written down. So those of you who have questions to ask, can you raise your hand and we will make sure you get something to write them down on, and I will be glad to convey them to the panel for you. Let me just mention we've had a number of very important themes that have been raised. I believe there's somebody back there. Thank you. With respect to, for example, the varied understandings of what freedom of speech means in practice, the impact of the need for big campaign spending, not just on voters, but I think most dramatically here shown on the thinking of elected officials and of people who are thinking about running for office as to where they will be needing to spend their time. The concern that any reforms that are adopted have consequences that include unintended as well as intended consequences, and how to try to figure out how to get more of the intended and fewer of the unintended. And the fact that in these polarized times, most issues become partisan issues, and that certainly has been true of campaign finance. Okay, let me see what we've got in the way of questions. We'll start, and then any of you who have a further question, just raise your hand and write it down. The first is, since it appears there will be no reform from Congress or the courts, do you see grassroots movements demanding change through organizing as the only remedy at this point?
Well, I'll jump in. I'll say that the thing that's most disheartening to me is just how much this whole situation has caused your average person to kind of give up on government and elections in the first place. A lot of that has to do with just a sense that, like, well, I don't have the big money, I can't really influence the outcome of election. But I think equally so, we've had so much gridlock in Washington that people have given up on government being able to solve any of the simplest problems they might face in their lives. And so they've given up. But what has to happen is these issues have to get elevated to the point where they become key election issues. Because once the politicians pick up that, gee, if I say I don't want to do disclosure, or I'm not willing to affirmatively say I'll fight for it, and that would become such an important issue in the election that I might lose, that's going to change the dynamic. But that requires a lot of grassroots effort, a lot of education to really get people focused in and really make it crystal clear what they want. So that is possible. But it just takes a lot of effort, starting with people in the room who are aware of the problem, have an idea of the solution, and then they have to get out there and really work with their friends and neighbors to scale that up.
This is generally, with great regret, I say it, not a voting issue for most people. If you ask most Americans what are the important political issues of our time, you know what comes up first. The economy, questions that have to do with jobs and unemployment. Campaign finance doesn't register at all in most polls. And
Margie, let me just make this addition to Matt's comments there.
Please.
He's certainly right. This doesn't register with most people. It's inside baseball.
Mm-hmm.
It's something politicians are interested in maybe, and a few others, but not the ordinary voter. But you said something a moment ago about the partisanship of the issue. We are not going to have meaningful, significant change unless it's bipartisan. The Democrats may have a majority on some of these issues marginally. There are a lot of good Republicans, I don't know about the Libertarians, who support it, many opposed to it. But you really need to make some fundamental changes in our structure. And in order to do that in this country, you need bipartisanship. So I think the hope here rests in building over a period of time bipartisan groups and bipartisan members of legislatures to work together to try to find some reasonable way to limit the influence of money. And we'll have to do like we do in most things, take it incrementally. As far as I'm concerned, I'd jump in as everything I said a moment ago, but that's not going to do it. We're going to have to proceed more incrementally. Paul, do you agree?
Well, I was just going to say that I agree totally that the frustrating thing here is really this is an issue that did have bipartisan support. I mean, yeah. McCain-Feingold, I mean, here you got one of the most prominent Republicans of the last 20 years that's the poster child with this, but it gets shut down by the Supreme Court. And so, I mean, that's why I think there also has to be a new theory, the First Amendment that's coming out of the law schools, that's coming out of law professors, out of others that are talking about the issue. So at some stage in the future, the Supreme Court's going to be open to something like a McCain-Feingold.
Well, and that brings up the other point, too, is obviously whoever becomes the next president may very well have a lot more appointments, and it was a 5-4 decision. And so if you get people appointed to the court that have a different understanding of the First Amendment than this current court, that's another way you could maybe get a case to reconsider that precedent. And that's that may be the most direct way to do it. So you're back to politics and kind of figuring out what those presidential candidates want to do on that issue and what kind of people they'd appoint to the court.
And I do agree with Matt. If we had more folks on the Supreme Court, I know that this is impossible. No one's going to get appointed to the Supreme Court that's been a politician anymore, because they'll all have had records, they'll all have had to vote and all that. But when we used to have people like an Earl Warren who'd been governor, or even Hugo Black who'd been senator, or Sandra Day O'Connor who'd been elected in Arizona, then they had some understanding of the political system, the role the money played, and how this all worked. Now it's theorists. So.
Okay, here's a very practical question. How can corporate personhood be such a one-way street? If corporations have the rights and benefits of a person but do not have a person's obligations and liabilities, for example, they can't be prosecuted criminally, why is that fair?
Well, corporations can be prosecuted criminally, and there are some. I taught a class talking about the death penalty today. That the line I've always heard: "Until you can execute one, though, then we really haven't." They're not real people, so it's a.
The National Chamber of Commerce channels the most dark money into politics, this questioner said. How would you get them to make public their contributors?
How would you get them to do what?
Make public their contributors so that it's no longer dark money.
Well, they won't do it unless they're required to do it. So you're going to have to mandate it. Look, the big contributors don't want their names identified as being a contributor. With exceptions, of course. This is a lot of different people, but by and large, that's the fact. So I don't think these big contributions flowing into campaigns now from specific donors, whether they're individuals or entities of some kind, I don't think you will get them to disclose unless you mandate it by legislation. I may be wrong. I'd like to be wrong on it, but I don't think I am.
It's one of the values of 501c4s that businesses and corporations find it particularly attractive to contribute to these groups because it's dangerous if you're a corporation to be known as a contributor to a partisan cause. Your customers may or may not like that partisan cause that you've contributed to and may decide to withhold their dollars from your corporation as a result, as the target corporation can certainly tell you. Given that, there is a lot of corporate money that has come in through 501c4s simply because of the fact that they know that the sources of funds will not be notified. Anyone else have something to say about that?
Yeah, I disagree with Congressman. I agree with Congressman Hamilton that you really just are going to have to figure out how to get the laws changed, or maybe some administrative regulations through a more aggressive administration or something, perhaps to the IRS that would just say 501c4s, you have to disclose this stuff, so we can better understand that you're complying with the requirements of a charitable organization. That's one possibility, but I don't know if there's a way a public could bring enough pressure directly on, say, a state or a U.S. chamber that would cause them to back off from that, because it's just so beneficial to their membership to have that mechanism to influence elections.
Mm-hmm. The IRS.
I used to run a 50 at the Brady campaign. We were both a 501c3 and a 501c4. And in the gun issue, the same issue. There, it was more people were afraid to be known as contributing to gun control because that's controversial. But it's always seemed to me on individual contributions, the federal contributions, the rule was always if it was over a certain amount, you had to disclose the name on your form. You could set up the same sort of rule for a 501c4. Anything over $500 or $1,000, list them. And then if they want to make a smaller, it's not, most of your contributors are usually small contributors. And if it's somebody that's giving you a $1,000 check or whatever, then you put them on the list, and it could be a list of 5,000 names maybe, but you've got it out there.
Here's a set of questions that go together very well and that I think perhaps all of our panelists might want to have something to say about. One of these questions is, it appears to me that one of the consequences of excessive money is that it can be used to trigger large voter turnout on specific issues that concern blocks of voters, which skew results in elections. For example, the NRA turning out gun enthusiasts or social conservatives for abortion restrictions. The next of those questions that relates so closely to it is, is, how can we get more people engaged in the political process so that they vote in elections? The only way to counteract a small minority is with a pretty substantial majority. Who'd like to start?
Well, again, I think we need to do more. I think we need to make it easier to vote. I think we need to take steps to encourage voting. I think we ought to look at moving vote election day to a Saturday. I think we ought to have 30 days before the election. I think efforts to supposedly tighten the voting rolls are meant to discourage voting. We need to do the opposite. Right now, that's the solution, to get more people out there. I think the idea of requiring people to vote probably doesn't work, but it's an interesting idea to discuss. I just, it's the solution to this is to get more of the population out there and getting to be a part of it, and then we'll have the challenge of each side trying to educate it or whatever their own way. But you need to have large groups. It's right now the difference between the off-year elections and the presidential elections is just amazing, and it skews the results. Yeah, when I was worked in D.C., I watched the Virginia elections. There, you never knew when an election was happening. They were having elections every month for something, so nobody ever knew who they were voting for, and as a consequence, nobody usually voted. It's just, let's say, here's when you're voting. It's going to be on Saturday. Make it easier to vote. Same-day registration. All those things. I think that'll help the system.
I always hope, of course, that the grassroots opinion will begin to assert itself. One of the things we have to encourage people to look at, you've all heard the advice, follow the money. You can look at the issues before the Congress, and you can predict where the money is going to come from. If the issue before the Congress is Obamacare, as it was a couple of years ago, the money is going to flow from the health industries, people associated with health, for it or against it. And you will see a big spike in the money coming from the health industry, broadly defined, flowing to members of Congress. Fast forward to the past year or two, and you had financial institutions under the gun because of the financial meltdown several years ago. And the Congress was looking at all kinds of regulatory mandates on banks and big financial corporations. Where did the money come from? You saw a big spike in the amount of money that flowed from the financial institutions to members of Congress. You could just predict this down the line. The money flows when their necks are in the block, is what it amounts to. Now, on the question of voter participation, a couple of things. Number one, we put a lot of barriers between the voter and the ballot. Illegal barriers. 6 o'clock cutoff in Indiana,
Ridiculous.
the earliest in the nation, is absurd. And it cuts out a lot of people who should vote. That's a simple thing. I used to talk to a lot of older people who were intimidated by going to the voting precinct. You got all these signs around, you got all the politicians out there shaking hands, you got a lot of activity. It's like a club, and people feel excluded from that. And I've had any number of older people say to me, I'm just intimidated by the voting. Well, Minnesota takes care of that problem. They just say, politicians, you can't go to the precinct on election day. You can't have any signs there. You can't have a shoot. The whole thing has to be sterile. So there are a lot of barriers. I can list 5 or 10 of them. But that's not the main problem. I'm all for those changes. The main problem is what you all have referred to. People just don't like politicians. They think we're not honest, any of us. They're cynical, and they're highly skeptical, and that's very tough to overcome. They feel their vote doesn't make a difference, and they have all kinds of complaints, most of which are valid. What do you do about that? Well, it's a tough one to answer. I'll give you one quick answer, and that is this, that the best antidote to cynicism is involvement. If a citizen is involved in trying to solve a problem in his or her neighborhood, his or her community, town, state, national government, they lose their cynicism and they become more active. A quick illustration. Many years ago in Clark County, Indiana, a young woman about 15, 16 years of age was killed at a railroad crossing. One of these tragic occurrences, inexplicable. Her mother came to me, totally distraught, as any of us would be, and said, "What can I do?" Well, we talked a while. A few weeks later, I learned that she had begun a campaign to improve the safety at every railroad crossing in Indiana. She talked to me about it. She talked to state legislators about it. She talked to the mayors about it. She talked to the media about it. And she went in a matter of a few months from being a total innocent with regard to the political process to being a person quite sophisticated in knowing how to make things work. And she stayed with it year after year after year, and as a result, Matt, I haven't looked at the figures lately, but as a result, the railroad crossings in this state became much safer. Cynicism can be overcome with involvement.
Yeah, I would say that, the candidates have to try to do a better job of trying to inspire people as opposed to just kind of scare them. I mean, the thing is, you got to find some basic human emotion that motivates people. And the truth is, it's like really easy to motivate people through fear and anger. That's like the easiest way to do it. So if you can just get them really angry about something or afraid of something, that kind of usually gets them fired up. But to really get them to be inspired to do something positive, that's really hard to do. That's why I will always have fond memories of the 2008 campaign, because when President Obama was running, I saw people involved in that campaign that had never been involved in politics in their life. They showed up at these headquarters, they had no idea what to do or why they're there, they just wanted to be a part of it. And for someone in politics who's so used to just like begging people, please vote, please care, please get involved, please give me $5, whatever, to have people just kind of spontaneously showing up was unbelievable. And yet it wasn't necessarily a happy ending after the election, how things have kind of spun out over the years. But I think that's the first thing, is candidates have to figure out a way to maybe inspire people as opposed to just use the simpler anger and kind of fear way to motivate people. And then Congressman Hamilton mentioned these barriers to voting. There is a concerted effort to suppress the vote. There's just no doubt about it. And it's interesting, you have a discussion. I chaired the election committee for 2 years when we were in the majority. This is probably maybe 6 years ago now. And it was like the worst job I ever had, and I asked to never be forced to do it again. Because you would sit there and the Democrats would say you're suppressing the vote trying to do this stuff, and the Republicans say you only win when you cheat. So we have to keep you Democrats from cheating by having voter ID and all these other restrictions. And it just keeps on coming. Today I voted against a bill that will concentrate the power no longer in the bipartisan election commission up at the state, where you have to have the Democrats and Republicans agree on things because it's kind of a even vote. They're instead moving powers over to the Secretary of State and just kind of letting her decide on her own. And one of the things that she's going to get to decide about is which voter registration form you use, because apparently there's a state form that's quite convoluted and difficult and asks for information that people don't often have, or it's harder to get. And then there's a very simple federal form. And I think the league and other people have decided, let's just use the simple federal form. Well, you know what? That law's going to pass, and very soon you're going to be told you cannot use the federal form, would be my guess. Mm-hmm. And there are things like that come along every day of the week. College students, they keep coming after, how can we shut down the college students from voting? And the last proposal, which got sidetracked, was they were going to tell anybody who was a college student, you had to pledge that you would live in the state for 1 year after you voted. Until somebody pointed out that, that you can't really do that under the Constitution. It's like equal protection. You got to, treat all adults the same. You can't say some have to live here for a year and others don't. So, but I mean, there's just been wave after wave of that kind of thing. And it's a very calculated decision about which constituencies they think are voting. They're going to probably change it now so vote centers can be decided on a simple vote of the election commissions in various counties, the election boards, right? So right now you have to have the Republicans and Democrats have to agree, unanimous vote, where you're going to put vote centers and if you're going to have vote centers. Well, now you're going to be able to do it by simple majority vote. So what that means is in the Democratic counties, you will have the election centers set up in locations that benefit the parts of the county that have the Democratic voters, and in the Republican-controlled counties, they will set up the vote centers to be in the parts of the county where the Republican voters live, and the other, whoever's on the outs in that county, they'll have to be hitchhiking to get to the vote center. And this, I see this stuff every day, and that's another thing that your average person doesn't care much about or think much about until they find it difficult to vote. So the whole suppression thing is going to have to be dealt with sooner or later.
Voter registration itself is unusual among democracies. In most democracies, you just go and vote. You're on the voter rolls and you vote. It's interesting when we talk about the suspicion that people have of public officials, there's also a lot of suspicion that public officials have of the public. And I think what we've seen in recent years is a very good illustration of the impact of one-party state governments on public policy. We are at a 100-year high now in the number of states that are governed entirely by one party, where the governor and both houses of the legislature are from one party. As Matt, as I'm sure become very familiar with, that means it's extremely easy for that one party to get its bills through, and it's also extremely important for that party to get its bills through because it doesn't know if it will still have that one party control 2 years from now. So it had better get its wish list through now rather than later. And we've seen that with respect to voting rights and a whole series of other things. Anybody else have anything to suggest about getting voters more involved?
Maybe about getting voters more involved and preventing so many super majorities, as you were mentioning there. I think voters are kind of smart in a way that they know that there's not very many competitive races, and I think you need more you need the voters to feel like their vote matters and their vote counts. I think one good way to do that is to take the redistricting process away from the politicians and turn it over to a panel or even preferably an algorithm, a computer algorithm. You give it certain parameters. You don't split this or that boundary and tell the algorithm you want more competitive races, and that's what you'll get. And I think it would increase participation as well.
Thanks.
I think that's a great idea from Greg. And the thing that's always bothered me lately is how many of these decisions are made in party primaries, and then there's almost no contest in the general election. And with all due respect to John and his candidate, I mean, the Republicans aren't going to be a factor, I'm sure, in the city race this year. And but more and more people are going to I keep wondering, why do we allow the political parties to put their name on the ballot in the fall? The government, in effect, runs the fall thing. Let people join a party if they wish, but let's run a neutral primary, or a primary where you can't put your party label on. And you can have the Libertarian, you can have a couple Republicans, a couple Democrats. If somebody gets over 50%, then the election's over. Then if not, take the top two, run them off in the fall. And more, that's how a lot of cities elect their mayors. There are more and more states going toward this sort of a nonpartisan election. And I always say, you can join to a party, but we don't allow you to put your party colors on the ballot or your party slogan on the ballot. So let's not put even the party name on the ballot. Vote for Lee or Greg or Paul or Matt, and you can figure out through the internet what they stand for and what their positions are. In my mind, this would weaken the parties, which would weaken the party caucuses then after the people get elected, and you'd be more likely to have a balanced budget group. And I mean, you could join the balanced budget group and the let's stay out of foreign wars group and let's do this group. And then you'd have more individuals really making up their minds, listening hopefully to the public when they make a collective decision. I think part of the party caucuses is one of the things that's making life a lot tougher too. So.
Here's an interesting question. What about the length of the election season? Could we only let campaigns operate in the last 2 months before the November election?
Would you repeat the question?
Could we limit the campaigns to 2 months before the election in November? So campaigns would just start in September and they would be 2-month campaigns.
really is a limitation on free speech.
Yeah, I agree they're too long, and a lot of other countries figure out how to have a short campaign, but I think that with the First Amendment and our general system, that would be pretty hard to do, and unless the public is just so annoyed by people starting early. I mean, look, we're full bore into the 2016 presidential campaign all of a sudden, started up in about the last month, and I kind of wish they would wait a while, but you know, they have the right to get out there and make their arguments.
But one of the reasons they get out there so early is because they have to raise money. I mean, that's what it works. That's, you know, so if you had public financing, if you had some of these other reforms, maybe there'd be less of that pressure.
I'd also be concerned about who fills that power gap, who fills that influence void. And I think you'd see more of this partisan media. You know, right now you get the Republican conservative folks, and they get all their news from Fox News, and you get the liberal Democratic folks, and they get all their news from MSNBC. And I think you may just lead to those kind of organizations having more power and influence if you limit the length of a campaign.
Mm-hmm. If we could, which we couldn't. One questioner says, what is it that accounts for the way in which Citizens United reverses previous court decisions? Does this reflect a lack of political experience on the court? Or why was it that for so long the court upheld various kinds of limits and now it's moving in the other direction?
I think the lack of politicians being on the Supreme Court is part of it. I think part of it too, it's just, you know, there are so many 5-4 decisions anymore, and really you're seeing less and less focus on precedent in some of these contentious areas. You know, and people used to get nominated for the Supreme Court without hearings in Congress. You used to have even sort of controversial figures get approved for the Supreme Court with 90-10 or 95-5 type votes. Now every one of these is, you know, it's a party fight, and so it's almost they come into office in effect having been politicized by the process to some degree. I mean, I know they're not supposed to be, and they try not to be, but I think it affects them. So.
Well, I think clearly some naivete about the political system plays a role in it, but I think it's really kind of a strident ideology, and I don't have the ability to recount it, but I've been to some panel discussions like this where people have actually walked through the steps of how the cases developed and what the court did, and the irony of it is if you go back and study that, the exact same people who've decried judicial activism and legislating from the bench totally manipulated and set up those cases to come up so they could get those 5 votes to knock out those limitations, and they've, you know, some of them signaled they'd like to do even more, and so you know, that's another issue right there. I do think that some people decided they would legislate from the bench, and they did it.
Do any of you know to respond to this curious question? Is dark money becoming a shield for foreign money? How significant a threat is that, and could it catalyze the overturning of Citizens United, of foreign money being contributed?
How can we tell? You know, we don't know where this money comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think it's the interesting thing about corporate citizenship, and it you know, corporations are incorporated in Delaware or a certain state, but you know, what is the corporation? It's more than just a piece of paper that was incorporated in Delaware. It's the shareholders, and who knows where the shareholders are from. And money goes all over the world now. I mean, there's foreign corporations have a lot of local U.S. investors. There's a lot of foreign investors in U.S. companies, and you know, because you're using this concept of a corporation as person, and a corporation can have investors and stockholders from all over, and boards of directors from all over, and CEOs from presumably any place. You know, you could have a corporation that, again, is technically a U.S. corporation that is wholly owned by Chinese investors or Korean investors or whatever, and then that is a way for money to get into the process.
Yeah, that issue has definitely been raised, that because you don't have any transparency, there's no way to kind of follow the money to its originating point. And so I think that if there were foreign nationals who wanted to try to influence the election, this would be the path they could take. And really, until you can get the disclosure requirements in there to be able to kind of go back and track the money from its various steps, you're not going to be able to figure that out. And I do agree that if you were able to identify examples where that had actually occurred, I think that's the kind of thing that would capture the concern of the public very quickly and perhaps force Congress to have to act where otherwise they don't want to.
I mean, we got reforms in the 70s because of Watergate. And in Watergate, you know, ancient memory for most people, but I mean, there were a lot of stories there. I mean, there were all, I mean, there's the break-in, but there's the safes full of money. There are foreign money coming up. You've got a lot of factors that just, you know, totally disgusted people, and they said we had to get some changes. And it's almost like, you know, maybe until we get an incident that is that flagrant, or at least that publicly flagrant, we're not going to see the change. But, you know, there's the potential for that.
No, I totally agree. I've said that the level of reform you get in government is directly proportionate to the level of the scandal. So Watergate was quite the scandal. And so Congress responded and really did some significant reform. You had a lot of people elected to Congress that were running on the idea of reform. And we saw a little bit of that where we had a few embarrassing examples of some conflicts in the state legislature. And so this year we've got a bill moving that strengthens some ethical requirements and obligations. And we've changed our rules. And now everybody's, you know, very concerned on their best behavior about the ethics because they feel like people are paying attention. But then that kind of wears off after a while until you get the next scandal. So maybe that's where this will ultimately come from, is when something really becomes clear that's not right because of the Citizen United and the dark money. That might be when you get a scandal big enough that causes people to demand change.
I would also question whether or not that's another symptom of the underlying problem, which is the government's far too involved and far too much. And if we didn't have a federal government that was involved in military adventures all over the world and involved in free trade agreements that have nothing to do with free trade, if there'd really be a lot of interest from foreign investors to buy our elections. I think if we had a constitutionally limited government the way the framers intended, if we'd really have a lot less money in politics.
Of course, even back in the 1870s, when we had more of the traditional constitutional government, you had all the big corporations buying up all the senators and the electeds too. So it's, you know, as long as government does anything, someone's basically going to figure out, you know, how to get a piece of that, I think. So.
Let me suggest one question that might be a heartening thought on which to end, and that's the question: is there any place for optimism in this new world order of super PACs and dark money? Can we generate any positive conclusions or recommendations?
Well, I would just say, and Paul just touched on it, I mean, we've had some pretty crazy eras in our country. You look at the robber barons, and then you have the progressive era come along, and so usually we find a way to correct the problems and kind of rejuvenate democracy. Just the frustrating thing is it always seems to take too long, but there comes some point, whether it's child labor or, you know, low wages, that people just say, we've had enough of this, and then they really do get involved and energized, and they start marching in the streets and all kinds of things, say, like, by God, something's going to change here. And we've seen glimpses of it. And the thing that frustrates me now is people, you'll see these glimpses like the protests against Wall Street that we had for a while. All across the country, we had people protesting by doing encampments and all this kind of stuff. But the thing that frustrated me is like, we're mad as hell. This is all corrupt. We're down here in the bottom. Everyone's ignoring us. And they'd say, but don't get involved in the government. That's all dirty. We can't trust all the parties are the same. You can't vote for anybody. Forget it. I mean, I had people who actually wanted me to be involved in helping them make videos about how corrupt everything was, and it was a waste of time to be involved in the government. I said, I'm not going to do that because I see every day distinct differences between parties and different elected officials, and who runs the place matters. And so I think that we've got to work on getting people to believe again on that. And at some point, they're going to get so frustrated with things, they're going to demand change, and then the politicians will have to respond.
That question you asked is a good way to end. I gave a speech in Iowa a few weeks ago. It's a terrific speech. I thought I did a great job. And a young woman came up to me afterwards and said, well, Congressman, that was just terrific. I learned so much. Is there any hope, she said. And I knew at that point that my speech was a total failure. You got to keep hope alive.
Yep.
Keep hope alive. Of course, there's plenty of grounds for hope. This is an extraordinarily resilient country. Its record of performance is unequaled anywhere in the world. We got a lot of problems. We've always had a lot of problems, and always will have a lot of problems. But there's a resiliency about the American people. Lincoln asked the right question: whether this nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. He thought that was the operational question at Gettysburg. It's the operational question in Bloomington, Indiana in 2015. Whether this nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. It isn't written in the stars. It's not carved in Indiana granite limestone that we will always be number one. It depends on us. And so when people ask me, is America rising or declining? Incidentally, I ask that question to students. Do you think America is rising or declining? I come from a generation when everybody, Paul, you're probably old enough, everybody was optimistic about the future. Everybody. Today, that's not true. So 40% of most classes will say we're declining rather than rising. But the real answer is, are we declining or rising? The real answer is, who cares? Who knows? We're all guessing. And what really counts is what we do about it, not what we think about, whether we're rising or falling, but what we do about trying to make the country better and stronger. And each of us have to do that in our own way. You and I aren't going to solve peace in the world. We're not going to solve the questions of the Social Security system, debt, or whatever bothers you. But we can make our corner of the world a little better. The country's got a lot of strengths to it. Don't give up on the United States.
And to me, it comes back to the title of the program tonight. It's the reason people raise this money is they're trying to affect the votes. The money doesn't directly get the vote. They're putting all that money in to try to change how you and you and you are going to act in the polling place, whether you're going to show up and who you're going to vote for. But the dollars don't directly do it. It still has to go through the voter. So that's what gives me hope, and that's where organizing, that's where grassroots activities, that's where individuals do make a difference. And while the dollars can oftentimes affect it, they don't always do it. And those dollars are going there to try to affect the vote, which means they're trying to affect us, which means I remain optimistic because I think people do end up making the right decisions. So I'm hopeful.
Here, here. Very good.
Let me add one more point that you can do as people here and as citizens of this country, and that's to talk with lots of people. Not just the people who agree with you, not just the people who you customarily share political views with because you know it's safe, because you and they have no differences between you. One of the only ways we'll deal with polarization in this country is when we, as friends of people with different views, are able to sit down with one another and say, I'm not going to hate you because you view things differently from me. I honestly want to know what you think is happening and why it's happening. And then I would like you to listen to what I think is what's happening. Let me ask all of you, break out of those silos, okay? Make sure that you can talk with people as much as you can about the things that matter to you. I very much appreciate your interest in this issue. I appreciate your coming this evening. If you would like to be included in email notices of events and meetings regarding this proposed 28th Amendment, please sign up in the foyer and please come and join us for some refreshments. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panel.
Sit down.